Before Beau Callahan ever laid eyes on Sadie Quinn, his world was a narrow strip of land fenced in by cedar posts, barbed wire, and the hard silence of a man who'd stopped expecting company. He'd buried his trust years ago, along with the pieces of himself he didn't care to find again. But on a gray morning, with the sun still hidden and the air damp with dew, she came walking down his road, boots caked in mud, dress clinging from a night's long miles, and eyes that carried more fire than fear. She asked for nothing more than to learn how to milk a cow, but the truth hung between them, like the weight of an unspoken debt. What Beau didn't know was that danger had followed her across every mile, and before the week was out, blood would be spilled on Callahan land. They'd fight side by side before they ever spoke of trust, and discover that sometimes the only way to stay alive in the West is to stand for someone else. The sun hadn't quite risen when Sadie Quinn came into view, her silhouette a shimmer in the gray half-light. She walked the final stretch of dirt road with the slow, steady resolve of someone who'd already crossed a dozen invisible borders. Her boots were caked with mud. Her faded cotton dress clung damply to her legs, soaked not just from the dew, but from a night of travel and sweat-born determination. She didn't shiver. The morning chill hadn't touched her. What coated her skin wasn't fear, it was will. At a distance, she could have been mistaken for a ghost, thin, determined, silent. But up close, she was far too alive. Strands of her dark hair, damp from effort, clung to her neck as she crossed the final yard to the gate. Her braid tied with a simple strip of leather swung against her back with a rhythm that matched her breath. Each step stirred the dust at her feet, but it was the air around her that seemed to shift, like even the wind paused to make room. At the gate stood Beau Callahan, a man made from splinters and silence. He leaned against the corral fence, one gloved hand resting on a worn axe, the other tucked into the crook of his elbow. His shoulders were broad, his jaw dark with days of stubble, and his eyes narrowed against the dawn, didn't miss a thing. For 20 years he'd kept to himself, carving a life out of cedar posts and cattle feed, saying little and needing less. He hadn't spoken to a woman since his wife left him hollow and bitter before his 40th birthday. Since then, his world had been gates and barbed wire horses and rain. Nothing more, nothing less. Until now. Sadie reached the wooden gate and stopped. She didn't knock, didn't call out, just stood there a moment, her chest rising gently beneath the thin, clinging fabric. Then finally her voice cut the morning stillness, low, warm, and steady, like creek water slipping over stone. "Morning, Mr. Callahan," she said. "Name's Sadie Quinn. I heard you might be able to teach me how to milk a cow." Beau's grip on the axe handle tightened. Not out of anger, not even out of suspicion. Just surprise and something else. A sensation he hadn't felt in a long time. Like the wind had changed and brought a memory with it. He looked her over, not with cruelty, but calculation. She was no runaway girl. She was a woman who'd seen something, carried it with her in her walk. Her silence, the way her eyes lingered on the horizon before settling on him. She didn't beg, didn't explain herself. Just stood there with that calm look, waiting for him to speak. 2 weeks, he said finally, his voice like dry rope against cedar. Sunrise lessons, my rules, no chatter, no questions. You do the work, you leave when I say. Understand? Sadie nodded. No protest, no smile either. Just that quiet fire in her eyes. And in that moment, Beau knew something he couldn't say out loud. She wasn't here for cows. Not just cows, anyway. Something was behind her. A weight she hadn't dropped. A reason she was willing to walk 15 miles across open country for a job no one wanted. Still, he stepped aside. She moved through the gate like someone stepping onto sacred land, not reverent, not hesitant, but deeply aware. And as the first rays of sun cracked through the clouds, she followed him toward the barn. Neither spoke again. But something passed between them in the quiet. Not trust, not yet, but the start of something. The kindling of a story neither of them had asked for, but both of them somehow needed. The first morning passed with few words and fewer expressions. Beau Callahan led Sadie Quinn across the yard just after sunrise, the air cool and still broken only by the rhythmic thud of their boots on packed earth. She carried a worn pair of gloves, her dress patched but clean, her braid neatly tied. Beau noticed she didn't look around, didn't gawk at the barn or the corrals. Her gaze stayed steady on his shoulder, not out of fear or defiance, but focus. Inside the barn, the scent of hay and old wood mingled with the soft huffing of cows still rising from their slumber. Shafts of gold light filtered through the slats, striping the floor like prison bars. Beau moved without explanation, grabbing a stool and a tin bucket and gesturing toward the gentlest cow in the herd, Marigold. She blinked slowly as he approached, unbothered, accustomed to the man's quiet ways. "Always move slow," he said, voice low. "They can sense nerves. You show 'em fear, they'll give you trouble." Sadie nodded. No questions. Just slipped on her gloves, rolled up her sleeves, and mimicked his steps with a careful precision that surprised him. She crouched low just as he had, moving with an instinct he hadn't expected from a newcomer. But when she reached for the udder, her hands trembled. Not much, just a flicker. Beau didn't comment. He let her struggle a moment, the first squirt of milk sputtering awkwardly into the pail, the cow shifting slightly with a flick of her tail. Slow, rhythmic, he murmured from behind, like breathing. "Don't yank coax." Sadie adjusted brows, drawn in concentration. Beau watched from a few feet away, arms crossed back, pressed against a stall beam. He told himself it was to make sure she didn't get kicked. But the truth crept in quick. He was watching her. The way she leaned forward slightly, her skirt catching on the edge of the stool. The way her shoulders squared, lips parted slightly in focus. A sheen of sweat already shimmered along the curve of her neck where strands of hair clung like threads of shadow. She wasn't graceful, not yet, but there was something quietly determined about her every movement, like she was working not just to earn a skill, but to prove something to herself. By the second day, her hands steadied. She arrived even earlier that morning before the first bird called. Beau opened the barn door to find her already there, leaning against the post with her gloves in hand. No coat despite the chill. She gave him a small nod. Still no questions. Still no backstory. Just the same quiet fire burning low behind her eyes. Beau didn't press her. That wasn't his way. He gave her the stool, the bucket, and let her set herself up this time. She approached the cow with a confidence that hadn't been there before. Her motions were smoother now, more fluid. He caught himself watching again. But what unnerved him wasn't desire, not exactly. It was the unfamiliar weight of wanting. Not just her body, not just the quiet curve of her lips when she smiled slightly after a good pull on the udder, but the stillness she brought. The way her presence shifted the air in the barn. Less like an intruder, more like someone returning home. He hadn't realized how lonely the space had become until her voice, soft and unsure, filled it. "Is this too fast?" she asked, glancing back. Beau stepped forward before he could think better of it. His hand closed gently over hers, guiding her pull, slowing her rhythm. "Like this," he said, his voice rough but steady. Her breath caught slightly, just for a beat. Their arms brushed. She didn't flinch. Neither did he. And then he stepped back. "Good," he muttered, clearing his throat. "Keep at it." Each day after followed a similar pattern. No personal talk, no questions. Just instruction, observation, silence. But something was changing beneath the surface, subtle as creek water cutting stone. Beau began setting out 2 mugs of coffee each morning instead of 1. Sadie began humming under her breath as she worked soft tunes, nameless but soothing in the hush of the barn. By the fourth day, she didn't need his guidance anymore. She carried buckets, swept the floor, shoveled hay, never once waiting to be told. She worked like the barn mattered to her, like the animals did. And Bo noticed things he didn't want to, how the sun hit her braid, just right when she turned toward the window. How she spoke to Marigold like an old friend. How his silence, once a shield, now felt like an empty echo whenever she walked out of the barn. That morning she laughed, a soft, sudden sound when one of the calves licked her glove, mistaking it for food. Bo froze at the sound caught in it. He hadn't heard laughter on his land in over 2 decades. It rattled him not because it was out of place, but because it fit, as if the barn had been waiting for a voice like hers. Later, when she slipped while carrying a water bucket, Bo caught her elbow without thinking. His hand lingered longer than it should have. Her skin was warm from work, and when their eyes met, he felt the breath hitch in his chest. Her lips parted not to speak, but in something like surprise. Or was it relief? He dropped her arm quickly, backing away. "Watch your footing," he muttered, turning to the feed barrels. That night, Bo sat alone in his cabin, staring at the tin cup in his hands. It was the same cup she'd held earlier, the rim faintly smudged with her fingerprint. Something inside him ached, not sharp, but slow and rising, a feeling he'd long since buried. Sadie Quinn was learning more than how to milk cows. She was learning rhythm routine, and unknowingly she was reshaping the hollow spaces he'd come to accept as permanent. And he was learning too. He was learning what it felt like to want something again, to want someone to stay. By the 5th morning, the barn had begun to feel less like a place of work and more like a world apart, tucked away from the dust and judgment of the outside. But Bo Callahan knew better than to trust peace. He'd learned long ago that stillness was often just the space between storms. Sadie Quinn was different that day. She wasn't slower, in fact, her movements were sharper, more precise, but there was something behind her eyes, something unsettled. Like her body was here, but part of her mind was still looking over her shoulder. She hadn't said anything. She never did not about herself. But as she bent to clean out the trough near the far stall, the early light caught her face, and Bo saw it the tiniest twitch in her jaw, a flinch barely there when the wood creaked behind her. It wasn't the sound that did it. It was what the sound reminded her of. He didn't ask. Instead, he passed her the feed sack without a word, and she took it with a quiet thank you. Her fingers brushed his warm, calloused but trembling just enough for him to notice. She caught herself and gripped the sack tighter, forcing the weight to anchor her. Later, while the cows chewed and the air warmed with the scent of hay, she asked the question, "Have you always worked this ranch alone?" The words came out soft, curious, but they hit hard. Not because of what she said, but because of what they stirred. Bo's jaw tensed as he straightened from the saddle he'd been oiling. The scent of leather filled the barn, mingling with dust and memory. "That's not your concern," he said flatly. Sadie paused, her gloved hands tightening around the stool. "Sorry. I just figured I said it's not your concern." There was no venom in his voice, but it was cold, sharp enough to cut through the air between them. Sadie's eyes dropped to the floor, her mouth pressing into a line. The moment hung there thick with discomfort. But then she surprised him. "You teach like someone who used to have help," she said. "Not defensive, just honest. Like you've done it with someone before." Bo didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence spoke for him. That night, as he sat on his porch with his boots crossed at the ankles and a cup of bitter coffee growing cold in his hands, Bo thought about her words, thought about the barn and how it used to echo with 2 sets of laughter, thought about the woman who once braided her hair with blue ribbon and sang while brushing the horses. But that was a lifetime ago. Now there was only Sadie with her secret eyes and too quiet strength. And that was the problem. She wasn't asking to be let in. She was simply there. In his barn. In his space. In his thoughts. She was like a creek that wore down stone, not with force, but with presence. On the 7th morning, something changed. The cows grew restless before dawn. Their lowing started early, sharp, unsettled, almost panicked. Bo rose from his bunk instantly. He knew the sounds of hunger, thirst, labor. This wasn't any of those. This was fear. He grabbed his rifle from the hook by the door and crossed the yard in long, fast strides. Sadie was already outside, halfway to the barn, her night shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her braid swung behind her loose at the end. "You hear that?" she asked, eyes wide. "They're spooked," Bo muttered, scanning the tree line. The early light hadn't yet broken the sky, a bruised purple over the ridges. They reached the barn. The cows stomped and tossed their heads. Something had them stirred. Bo moved fast, checking the stalls, the gates, the fences. Nothing inside was wrong. Then he saw it. A plume of dust on the far edge of the property, rising, winding like smoke. Horsemen. 3, maybe more hidden behind the front. His stomach turned to stone. "Get inside," he ordered, already loading the chamber. Sadie didn't move. Bo turned toward her. "I said get inside." "I know who they are," she said, voice tight. "They're not strangers." He froze, his eyes locked on hers. "You want to explain that?" Sadie hesitated, her lips parting. But what came wasn't confession. It was fear. "They're from my husband's old crew, gamblers, collectors. He owed more than he let on. I left Cheyenne thinking I'd lost them, but I guess not." Bo exhaled sharply. The breath burned on its way out. He should have known. He did know. He'd felt it from the moment she crossed his gate, that she wasn't just some desperate widow looking for cow lessons. She was running from something, or someone, and now they'd found her. The riders slowed as they neared the main path, staying just outside the fence line. Bo counted them 3, all armed. The lead rider was lean and sharp-faced, with a revolver slung low and a gaze like coiled wire. Callahan, the man, shouted, his voice knifing through the silence. "Hand over the girl, and we walk away." Peaceful. Sadie stepped back, gripping the pitchfork she'd left by the barn door. Bo watched her, her shoulders square, eyes forward. She didn't flinch. "You know her name?" Bo asked, without looking away from the riders. The man smiled. "We know everything, mister, and we don't like to be kept waiting." Bo raised the rifle slowly. "She's not going anywhere." The lead rider's grin twitched. "Then you're making yourself a problem." A moment of stillness. 1 breath. 2. Then the gunfire cracked across the fields. Bo dove behind the fence post, splinters flying as bullets shredded wood. Sadie ducked low, crawling for the side of the barn. She didn't scream, didn't sob, just moved fast, controlled. Bo returned fire, his rifle jerking in his hands as he clipped one of the riders in the arm. The man yelped and fell back, but the others kept coming. Their horses thundered forward, wild and reckless. Inside the barn, cows bellowed in fear. Saddles creaked, the air filled with dust, gunpowder, and fury. And amid it all, Sadie Quinn stood, breath-ragged, pitchfork in hand, the ghost of her past, now flesh and blood, at her doorstep. The first shot cracked the silence like dry timber snapping in a wildfire. Bo Callahan dropped to one knee behind the corral fence, heart pounding like hooves on frozen ground. Wood splintered above his head, shards raining down as bullets chewed through the post. He counted the shooters instinctively, 2 from the ridge, 1 circling wide. These men weren't bluffing. They'd come to take Sadie by force. The rifle was warm in his hands, an extension of instincts forged in another lifetime. He squeezed off a shot, quick, controlled, and caught a rider high in the shoulder. The man jerked backward, nearly thrown from his saddle. Not dead, but out of the fight for now. Sadie was still by the barn, crouched low behind a feed barrel. Her shawl had fallen hair undone, and trailing over her shoulders like loose rope. She didn't scream, didn't panic. She moved like someone who'd been hunted before. "Back door," Bo barked. "Go through the feed room. Get to the house." She shook her head. "I'm not leaving you." Bullets hit the barn wall, sending a tremor through the frame. A lantern hanging from a nail came crashing down, smashing against the floor oil seeping into the dirt. Bo didn't argue. There wasn't time. One rider was charging the corral full tilt, a heavy-set man with a sawed-off shotgun raised and eyes wild with adrenaline. Bo stood braced against the fence post and fired again. The bullet caught the man's horse in the flank. The animal shrieked, bucking violently. The rider tumbled into the dirt in a cloud of hooves and dust. Bo didn't wait. He vaulted the fence and ran low boots, crunching dry gravel. The downed rider was already scrambling up, hand reaching for the shotgun slung across his back. Bo tackled him hard, both men slamming into the dust. They rolled fists, swinging elbows, cracking bone. The rider was younger, stronger, but Bo had 20 years of solitude behind his rage, and it surged now like floodwater. He landed a brutal elbow to the man's jaw, then slammed the back of his head into the packed earth. Once, twice. The man went still, breath ragged. Bo rose, chest heaving. The sound of hooves drew his attention. The last rider, the leader, was flanking wide-headed straight for the cabin. Sadie Bo bellowed. She was already moving, sprinting toward the house, dress torn at the hem, one boot nearly falling off. The wind caught her hair, and for a moment she looked like something wild, untethered. The man on horseback reached the cabin porch just as Sadie climbed the steps. He leaned low, one hand grabbing for her waist. She screamed and twisted, slamming her fist into his ribs. He grunted, but didn't let go. Bo's rifle was too far. He grabbed the downed rider's revolver and ran. Sadie struggled, knees braced against the railing, trying to break free. The rider yanked harder, dragging her backward by the arm. Her dress tore a sharp, ripping sound fabric, giving way at the shoulder, but she fought like hell, elbows flying. Bo raised the pistol and fired once. The bullet nicked the man's thigh. It wasn't fatal, but it made him howl and loosen his grip. Sadie fell back against the porch. In a single motion, she snatched a shovel propped against the cabin wall and swung. The flat steel head cracked against the rider's ribs with a sickening thud. He fell gasping, rolling into the dust. Bo reached her a breath later, chest burning. He grabbed the fallen man by the collar and dragged him toward the hitching post. Blood trickled from the man's mouth, his breathing wheezy but steady, still alive. "You all right?" Bo asked, barely able to speak through the adrenaline. Sadie nodded, panting. Her cheeks were streaked with dirt and sweat, her dress torn, her hair hanging wild and tangled. But her eyes, those eyes were fire. "I'm fine," she said. "He's not." They bound the man in rope from the barn and dragged him to the stall. He didn't fight, too winded to do more than mutter curses. The second rider, the one Bo shot earlier, had disappeared into the distance, leaving only hoof prints and a trail of blood. The leader, though the one who'd spoken Bo's name with poison, he wasn't finished. From the hill, his voice rang out. "This ain't over. Callahan, you're protecting what ain't yours." Bo stepped forward, hands bloody, revolver steady at his side. "She's not yours either." The man sneered from his saddle, gripping his side. "We'll be back. You know that. Ain't a fence high enough to stop us." He turned and galloped off, dust rising behind him like a storm cloud. The prairie swallowed the sound of his hooves. Silence returned, heavy and untrustworthy. Sadie leaned against the porch post, one hand still clenching the shovel knuckles white. She looked down at her torn dress, then up at Bo. For a long time, neither of them said a word. Finally, she broke the silence. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Why, Bo met her gaze, jaw clenched. "Because I ain't letting another soul be taken on my land. Not again." Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. There were no thanks, no tears, just a shared look. Two people shaken, breathless, changed. Bo turned toward the barn. "We need to secure the fence. They'll be back." Sadie nodded. "I'll help." He stopped, looked over his shoulder. "You sure I didn't come this far to run now?" There was something in her voice, not defiance, not pride. It was something quieter, stronger, the same tone Bo had used the day he buried his past and started building walls. Only now someone was standing on the other side of that wall, shovel in hand, dress-torn, heart still pounding, and she wasn't backing down. Bo didn't say anything more. He just nodded, and together they walked toward the barn, toward the wounded man they'd captured, toward the work that needed doing before the sun went down. Blood had been spilled on Callahan land. But it wasn't just violence that filled the air. It was something else. The sharp edge of a bond forged under fire. A shared resolve. And beneath it all, something unspoken, but undeniable. They'd fought as strangers, but they'd survived as something else entirely. By the time the sun crested over the ridge the next morning, the dust from yesterday's bloodshed still hadn't settled. The wounded rider lay bound in the old calf stall, one arm twisted awkwardly behind him, his mouth gagged with a torn scrap of saddle blanket. He'd spent the night groaning, coughing, trying to break free, but Bo Callahan had secured the knots himself. And Bo never tied loose. Outside the corral fence was half-mended, patched hastily in the moonlight after the last shot was fired. The air still carried the metallic sting of gunpowder, and the cattle remained jumpy, their low grumbles a chorus of unease. Nothing about the ranch felt quiet anymore, not the land, not the wind, not the man who owned it. Bo stood near the pump shirt, clinging to his back with sweat and dirt. His lip was split from the brawl, a bruise darkening his temple. He splashed cold water over his face and leaned on the edge of the trough, breathing in the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, the kind that warns. Sadie Quinn stepped out onto the porch, her dress stitched at the shoulder with rough thread, and her braid, redone tight, controlled no loose ends. But the softness she'd worn in her eyes during those first few barn mornings was gone. In its place was something flint-sharp. Bo turned as she approached his gaze, trailing the cut above her eyebrow, the faint swelling on her cheekbone. She didn't look away, didn't shrink. If anything, she stood taller now, like the fire from yesterday had burned away what little fear she had left. "They'll come back," he said plainly. Sadie nodded. "Let them. That ain't bravery talking. That's desperation." "I know," she said. "It's both." Bo studied, her jaw clenched. He wanted to tell her to leave, to ride out before the rest of those bastards returned with more guns and less patience. But he couldn't, because some part of him, the part that hadn't spoken in years, had already made a decision. "You stay," he said slowly. "You follow my lead. We turn this place into a fortress." Sadie's eyes flicked toward the barn. "The fence is the stall with the tied-up man." "What does that mean?" "It means you learn to shoot," Bo replied. "You learn where to take cover, how to watch the tree line, how to reload without shaking." She nodded once, no hesitation. "Then show me." They spent the day prepping like it was war, because it was. Bo walked the perimeter of the property, pointing out blind spots in the brush and elevation along the ridge. Sadie kept pace, her notebook pages filled with scribbled notes about angles, line of sight, and signal flares. She asked sharp questions not out of fear, but because she wanted to be ready. In the barn, he handed her an old Winchester. "This one's lighter. Recoil won't knock your shoulder off." Sadie took it in both hands, weight steady. Her grip was wrong, fingers too tight, and her stance leaned too far back. Beau stepped behind her, adjusting gently. His palms brushed her waist as he squared her hips, then slid along her arms to place her elbows right. "Don't fight it," he murmured. "Let the shot move through you." The rifle cracked once, echoing through the canyon. She barely flinched. They kept at it until her shoulder ached, until her breath came in sharp gasps and her hands blistered. But she didn't stop, and Beau didn't ask her to. By nightfall, she could hit a tin plate nailed to the fence post from 30 paces, not every time, but enough to matter. She cleaned the rifle in silence, oiling each piece as Beau watched from the porch, his mug of black coffee untouched in his hand. "You always fight like that?" he asked eventually. Sadie didn't look up. "Only when I've got something left to lose." He nodded slowly, staring out at the horizon where night was swallowing the last streaks of sun. "Funny. That's what I've been afraid of all these years." She paused, brush stilling in her fingers. "Being needed. No. Needing someone." The words settled between them like ash. Inside the cabin, the wounded rider shifted, grunted against his gag. Sadie stood wiping her hands. "What are we doing with him?" Beau's expression hardened. "He's leverage. We keep him alive, maybe we buy time. Maybe we learn something." "Or he's bait," she said. "Maybe that too." They checked on him together, not as jailer and assistant, but as partners. Sadie held the lantern while Beau knelt and examined the ropes, checked the man's wound. He was conscious but weak, angry. His eyes burned with hatred, not just for Beau, but for Sadie. She didn't flinch beneath his stare. "He knew my husband," she said flatly. "Knew how to hurt women too." Beau stood. "He won't touch you again." Later, back at the porch, they sat in quiet. No gunfire, no thundering hooves, just crickets in the brush and the creak of old wood beneath them. Sadie pulled her knees to her chest, staring at the moon rising over the ridge. "I never thought someone like you would fight for someone like me," she said. Beau's voice was low. "You think I did it for you?" She turned her head. "I did it for what I saw in your eyes when you picked up that shovel," he continued. "That's not weakness. That's fire. It reminded me of something I thought I'd buried." She didn't respond right away, just reached over and placed her hand lightly over his, their fingers, brushing no grip, no pressure. Just touch, a truce, a vow, not in words, but in presence. From the distance came the soft cry of an owl, the wind tugging at the porch rafters. The ranch was still for now, but not safe. Never safe. Beau looked at Sadie and realized he'd stopped thinking of her as a stranger. She wasn't a guest anymore, or a problem to solve. She was part of the land now, woven into the soil, the silence, the structure. And if the men came back, and they wouldn't be facing one man guarding a wounded pride. They'd be facing two people who'd chosen to stand together. The wind had shifted by dawn. It no longer whispered fear across the ranch, but something heavier, something rooted. The scent of iron still clung to the dirt where blood had dried, and smoke from last night's fire curled lazily from the chimney. The corral was quiet again. The cows grazed cautiously, their agitation dulled by exhaustion and the steadiness of routine. But nothing was the same. Sadie Quinn stood just past the gate, the one she'd walked through nearly 2 weeks earlier in silence and soaked cotton. Her hands were blistered now, her braid uneven, the hem of her dress tattered from too many sprints through dust and danger. But she stood with her back straight, her chin high. Not as a widow, not as a fugitive, but as someone who decided to stop running. Across from her, Beau Callahan adjusted the strap of his rifle eyes fixed on the ridge beyond the grazing field. The land felt tighter somehow, not smaller, but more aware, as if it too was waiting for what would come next. They hadn't spoken much since binding the last man in the barn. There wasn't much left to say. Words weren't the currency of what had passed between them. Instead, it was in the way Beau had handed Sadie the last nail, as they reinforced the corral wall, their fingers brushing briefly, steady, familiar. Or the way she had checked his bandages in silence, not as a nurse or guest, but as someone who had earned her place in the room. They had forged something not out of love, not yet, but out of blood grit, and the choice to remain when flight would have been easier. Sadie's voice finally broke the stillness. "They'll come again." Beau nodded, probably with more firepower. "And you're still okay with me being here?" He didn't look at her right away, just stared at the line where sky met hill. Then, with a voice as quiet as the wind that carried it, he answered, "I'd rather fight beside someone who knows fear and stays than a dozen men who run at the first sign of smoke." She swallowed hard, her eyes shining not with tears, but with something deeper. Recognition. Belonging. A hawk circled high above the pasture, its shadow drifting over the barn. Somewhere in the timber a branch cracked, but neither of them flinched. This land had seen pain before. It would see it again. But now it had new guardians, not perfect, not whole, but willing to defend, willing to trust, willing to bleed if that's what it took to reclaim something worth keeping. Sadie stepped forward until she was at Beau's side. Her hand found his rough and scarred. This time she didn't let go. "I'll help rebuild," she said. "I'll stay, even if the sky turns black and they come riding with flames at their heels." Beau glanced at her, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not a smile, but something close. "You already are rebuilding," he said, "whether you meant to or not." They stood that way as the sun rose behind them, casting long shadows across the ranch. The same gate that once marked the boundary of Beau's solitude now hung open behind them, not forgotten, but transformed. It no longer kept people out. It welcomed what might come in risk, yes, but also redemption. This wasn't the end of their fight. The road ahead would be hard, maybe bloody, but neither of them stood alone now. And sometimes in the West, that was enough. If this story stirred something in your soul, a longing for grit, grace, and second chances, don't ride off just yet. Hit that subscribe button, leave us a comment, and share where you're listening from. At Whispers of the West, every silence holds a story worth telling.